Hello, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to John Milton for the Satanic Temple Colorado's book club selection for February 2019, Paradise Lost. I'm Victor Lament, and I'm just going to give you a quick little history about John Milton and the mid-1600s England, and try to give you a little historical context for what was going on at that time, just to try to get everyone ready to jump headfirst into reading Paradise Lost. So, John Milton was born in 1608 to an English Puritan family. His father was a composer and a scrivener, and they were a wealthy and educated family. John Milton was extremely well educated in London from a very young age, studying at Cambridge. Upon completing university, he was already known among his peers as a skilled poet, and in a short time he grew to be a rather famous writer. He remained a Puritan throughout his entire life, stating that he felt religiously called to poetry as a profession. And before we go any further, I think this is a good time to mention that we will be enforcing a zero-tolerance policy for poet-who-knows-it jokes, which are always in bad taste, but this is especially true for Milton, and at the end of this video, you'll see why, so please refrain. So, after college, Milton spent some time traveling to study and write, but in 1639, the Puritan Revolution kicked off the English Civil War. John Milton returned to London to be a political revolutionary and write political pamphlets supporting the Puritan Party's political position. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here about the specifics of the English Civil War, other than to say that the king at the time, King Charles I, was enacting some very unpopular policies that were not supported by the Parliament, which was led by Oliver Cromwell. And Parliament was calling for the reformation of the Church of England. And in 1649, the Puritans were successful in their attempt to overthrow the monarchy, and Charles I was publicly executed. And that's him right there. So, after that, Milton enthusiastically took part in helping establish a new non-monarchic government, and he offered to become the new government's Latin secretary, which was an interesting position. It would leave a pretty big mark on his work. So, back then, Latin was the official language of diplomacy, and his job was to reach out to foreign dignitaries and justify the king's execution, and basically explain why it was okay for his countrymen to cut their king's head off but still be taken seriously as a legitimate sovereign country. So in these writings, he advocated for all nations to hold their rulers accountable, and he staunchly defended regicide as an option for the people when a monarch has abused their authority. He was in essence creating a manifesto detailing why it's the people's duty to rise up against and kill their unjust rulers. Working for this new republic, it only lasted for about a decade before it started to collapse and the people started calling for their rightful monarch to be put back on the throne. So Charles II took the throne in 1660, and he kind of went full Game of Thrones on anybody who had a role in his father's death. Milton was imprisoned, but he was released avoiding execution because he had gone blind. And this is kind of when Milton goes from an idealist raging against tyrannical authority to a bitter, defeated, quote, prophet no one listened to, living in self-imposed exile for the rest of his life. Ever since he was in university, Milton had planned to write an epic to try to get his name in the canon with Homer and Virgil. And originally he had planned to write it about King Arthur, to kind of glorify England. But he changed his mind when he and England had their little falling out. So he took the idea of the epic he'd been with him his entire life, and he changed the subject to that of a play he was already working on, which was about Adam in the Garden of Eden. And that's kind of how Paradise Lost was born. All in all, it was written over a 25-year period. So we should probably get something out in the open. This poem is difficult. For one thing, it's written in Latinate, which has seriously complex sentence structures and unusual word order. It takes some practice getting used to before most people, including scholars, can really tell what each line is even about. I mean, the first sentence is 16 lines long, so and depending on your printing, there are some full pages that only have 2 sentences on them, so it's crazy. Also, this poem is written in blank verses of iambic pentameter, so we are dealing with unrhymed metered couplets. Add to that, Milton is very fond of wordplay, so that means that we have lots of homophones, intentional misspellings, cryptic capitalization, words with double and triple definitions, and puns all throughout Paradise Lost. It's also filled with obscure Hebraic, medieval, and Renaissance references, long lists of names and places that probably would have been more familiar to 17th century readers, but probably just as many that would have been obscure to them too. As Milton throws in like Mesopotamian, Phoenician, and Sumerian deities just to prove that he knows them and you don't. Also, the style takes some time to get accustomed to. There are a lot of long, formal monologues and characters quoting other characters and complex metaphors that make it hard to decipher what the subject of the sentence even is. To paraphrase one of our participants in the book club, why does Milton have to write like such an asshole? Well, for better or worse, this is kind of on purpose. Milton did set out to create the greatest poem ever written, and to try to show that he can do it, he is showing off a little. But there's more than just flaunting his writing ability or being intentionally challenging to the reader. He says right in the invocation to Book 1 that he's going to do, quote, things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. So he says that he's setting out to justify the workings of God, and he feels that the complexity of the writing should reflect the complexity of the theme of origin of evil itself. So, lastly, Milton wanted to kind of inspire awe with the poem's grandeur. So all this boasting at the beginning of Paradise Lost is more than just swagger. He's trying to set the stage, and he's trying to psych you out a little. And there's probably one other thing you should probably know about John Milton. Milton had a straight-up real-life mutant superpower. Milton had a photographic memory. So John Milton could recall literally every word of every single thing he'd ever read in his entire life. He used his epic works to demonstrate that he could do this. He would reference characters and places from Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Italian literature that are obscure to most scholars. Remember, this is a man who was practically an English major since before he could walk, so this guy has read a ton of books, and being able to basically look them up in his mental catalog whenever he wants to take advantage of this, he likes to flaunt that. So you'll see this all over Paradise Lost. Another thing you'll notice is how the loss of his eyesight affected him and the way that he writes. This was especially hard for him because of this visual memory, so look for a lot of references to sight, memory, and how he characterizes darkness and confusion in this poetry. And here's a bonus little fun fact. Milton was openly opposed to female literacy in his lifetime. He's actually just kind of generally pretty misogynistic. But due to his blindness, he had to rely on hired women to write down Paradise Lost for him. So he'd write lines in his head every night, and then he would wake up in the morning and dictate them to them, and they would write them down for him. So, all right, I want to talk a little bit about this. So one of Milton's goals in Paradise Lost was to solve a problem called Theodicy, which means the justice of God's actions. So the argument basically goes something like this. If God is an all-loving, benevolent deity, and God is an all-powerful deity, why does evil exist in the world at all? If God is all-loving, then why do babies get cancer? If God's all-loving and God can do anything, why is anyone forced to endure suffering at all? Why do puppies feel pain? I mean, really, ultimately, the question boils down to, why do bad things happen to good people? I mean, only one of the points on this triangle shown here is a demonstrable fact of life, which is that evil and suffering exist in the world, and the other two are a matter of faith. You can prove that bad things happen all the time, but one has to believe that God loves you and that God can do anything. So, this was the ultimate God-killer philosophical argument of its time. This was the solid winning argument for atheism in the 17th century. And Milton just kind of tells everybody, listen, I've solved the mystery. I have it all figured out. I'm going to explain why God allows suffering the way that he does. You see, it's not God's fault. So, why do people still read Paradise Lost? Well, in general, it tells a complex story that is described in only a few short verses of the Bible. Milton's version of events has supplanted that of the Bible in most people's minds. Even if they don't know where Milton's answer to the Theodicy question, everyone will be able to tell you a pretty good summary of what his answer was. Everyone is familiar with this exaggerated version of the Genesis story. I mean, Satan's name isn't even mentioned one time in the story in Genesis, and yet Milton's accounting of events has become the narrative known the world over of why man is made to suffer. Milton has effectively become the world's most accomplished fanfic author. Another reason why is Paradise Lost is very comprehensive. It covers so much ground in Christian mythology, from the rebellion of the angels and the resulting war in heaven, the creation, the fall, and the history of man, all the way to the of Christ. It covers a lot of ground. Another reason Paradise Lost is still read and taught today is because he set out to write the greatest poem of all time. And there are many who believe that he succeeded. So, Milton set the bar for all future poets to be judged against. Ever since Paradise Lost was published, our literary circles and they've been traditionally divided into two camps. Those who think that Paradise Lost is great because it finally answered this huge and vexing theological problem, and those who think that Paradise Lost is great because it is unconsciously hostile towards God. But in either camp, it's still considered one of the greatest accomplishments of the English language. And we should probably not overlook the fact that due to its complexity, there are some serious bragging rights that come with having read and mostly understood this epic piece of literature. There is a reason that the most famous lines of Paradise Lost are on the opening page of Book 1, and that's because that's basically as far as people get before they give up and go read the Wikipedia article. Being able to say that you really, truly read Paradise Lost is something you should feel good bragging about. But as Satanists, we also read Paradise Lost for some other special reasons. Paradise Lost paints a portrait of Satan that was very unique in its time. Milton's Satan is complex and sympathetic, and his speeches describing the conflict between justice and tyranny mirror a lot of our own struggles today. The points and questions that Milton's Satan poses will likely make up a vast majority of the conversation we're going to have about Paradise Lost in the coming months. And also because Satan is basically our main character, telling us a story from his own point of view, Paradise Lost also forms the basis for nearly all depictions of Satan ever since it was published. This poem was so influential in capturing the world's imagination that Milton's Satan character has been personally blamed for evil existing in the world for over 350 years. And last, reading Paradise Lost seriously shows off your Satan cred. But seriously, it's because this is kind of where it all began. The mythology of Satan, where we will be reading about and discussing in this book club for hopefully years to come, all started here. Milton took a few lines from here and there from the Bible and formed the mythology that is arguably the world's most famous literary character. Alright, so these are the directed reading questions that Persephone sent you all via email, so try to keep these in mind when reading through Paradise Lost. 1. What ideas, imagery, and story elements of the fall did Milton invent in Paradise Lost? What does modern Satanism draw on Milton's version of Satan? What traits do we idealize about him, and what traits do we not adopt? How do you think Milton's life and philosophy inspired Paradise Lost? Milton was a Christian, but do you think his philosophy was in line with modern Satanism? Should we consider Satan the protagonist? Why or why not? Should we consider Satan an anti-hero? Why or why not? And as modern Satanists that draw on Milton's Satan, do we consider ourselves anti-heroes? And there's one last thing you should keep in mind while reading. William Blake famously said of John Milton, Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. And more recently, I have said, Milton was of the devil's party and he absolutely knew it. So, which, if either of these gentlemen was correct? Why did Milton make Satan the quote-unquote good guy in his most prestigious work intended to exalt God's love and power? Was Milton of the devil's party? And if he was he intentionally making us have sympathy for the devil, or was he unknowingly siding with Satan? Alright, and that's the end of the video. If you like this, let me know in the comments below or drop me a line, and I'll be happy to keep making these as we go through the 2019 reading list. If you found this video and you're participating in the Satanic Temple Colorado's book club and you'd like to find out more, click the link to our Facebook in the description below to get information about how to sign up. Thanks everyone, and hail Satan!